Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Today we are talking to Dr. Jean Kritsky. Jean is the Dean of the School of Behavioral and Natural Sciences at Mount St. Joseph University in Cincinnati. He is also the author of the book Periodical Cicadas, the Brew 10 edition. Hi, Jean. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thank you for talking with us today.
Oh, sure, Shannon. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really excited and looking forward to this conversation because, as a child, I always just enjoyed finding the cicada exoskeletons on the different trees. And of course, as a kid growing up in Kentucky, I had to wear them all over me, put them in my hair, do all the kid stuff with them. And even now as an adult, I still love finding them and sharing them with people and teaching people what little bit I know about cicadas. And they're just fun. And this is supposed to be a very interesting year for many of us as far as cicadas go, which is why I originally reached out to you. But then in preparing for this conversation, I learned that cicadas are even much more interesting biologically than I ever gave them credit for. And as a wildlife biologist and naturalist, that just sends me down a million new rabbit holes that I cannot wait to explore with you and talk to you about. But before we get into that, let's stop for a second and just tell everyone a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. I'm Jean Kritsky. I am a PhD trained entomologist. I did my PhD work at the University of Illinois, working with the cicada specialist there by the man by the name of Louis Stannard. He's now passed, unfortunately, but he wrote the Periodical Cicadas of Illinois. I did my undergraduate work at Indiana University with Frank Young, and Frank was the cicada specialist for Indiana. If I look at my niche with regard to cicadas, I followed the greats that were the major figures in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I got my degree, and then I'm joining them for the 80s and the 90s. They've now passed. I'm now carrying that on for a block. There are already young people working that are ready to pick up when I decide to go down the cicada tunnel as well. I taught at what's now called Trine University for 5 years in northern Indiana. Then I taught for a year at Minya University in Egypt. I've written a book on beekeeping of ancient Egypt. I've spent probably more than a year of my life in that country. I love Egypt. And then been here at Cincinnati since '83. I'm now the longest serving faculty member at the university, and they kicked me upstairs to dean.
Very cool. So how did you get into cicadas? Because you've done a lot of different things there.
Well, that's Frank Young. I enrolled in my entomology class, not because I was desirable. I wanted to be an entomologist. I originally wanted to go into human paleontology by this time. And I was talking to my professor in human paleontology at Indiana, Paul Jameson. He's still with us. And I took his introductory class my first semester, my freshman year. That was the first class I went to. That was also his first professional teaching job after he finished his PhD. So we had that in common. And I asked him questions like, well, how do we know that this skull is a different species from this skull? You only have a sample of one of each. And he said, well, you ought to take an entomology class because they're doing this thing called morphometric analysis and numerical taxonomy. And so the next year when I was signing up for my classes as a sophomore, in those days we went and collected computer cards, and it was done by a lottery. Sophomores were the last, and the last of the last of the last was the K's. And so I get there, everything is closed. And so I walk up to the zoology table and I say, you have anything open? And I still remember this. It's one of those pivotal moments in my life. She says, I'm sorry, all we have is entomology in the lab. And I thought, okay. Paul said I should take entomology. I'm taking entomology. And by the second week of the class, I was going to be an entomologist. Frank Young was one of the most interesting individuals I've ever met. He clearly, now in his mid 50s, going into his early 60s, somewhere in that area, loved every day of his life. He loved going into the lab, and he just had so much fun. Frank had a great sense of humor, and it was the second week of class. In his class, he starts talking about periodical cicadas. And I thought, whoa, this is really cool. And in part because I'm a frustrated historian. I love history. And I thought, and as I listened to this, I thought, there must be a way of using historical methods of research to look at cicadas. And so I made it a point to meet with some PhD historians. And I said, so in science, we have the scientific method. And I said, there's got to be something like that in history. And they say, yes, there is. You look at your sources. There's primary sources, secondary sources, tertiary sources, which ones you hold in higher esteem, and so on. It made a lot of sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started looking for historical records of periodical cicadas. And I was fortunate while in grad school to run across a series of stapled publications from the USDA that in two instances in particular, summarized all the historical data they had collected on different broods, in general, going back to 1634.
Oh,
But
wow.
with brood 10, they had the records from brood 10 from its first observation in 1715 and another 900 more that they published, and with the dates and the counties, the year, and the towns in those counties, and the years that cicadas have been reported. And that led me to going to newspaper morgues. I'd check out the May, June issues of their newspapers for cicada years and just turn the pages looking for anything that had about locusts or cicadas, as they called them locusts starting in the 18th century. And by the time I finished grad school, I had close to 7,000 historic records.
Oh, wow.
And I'd been working with the Apple IIe's, just moved over to the Macintosh. And I found this really interesting computer program that was used in business as a demographic marketing tool to see where there were potential locations for golf courses. But I didn't care about the golf course. Although I played golf at the time. I'm not very good, but I was able to convert my 7,000 historic records into the codes for that program. And I could then map out at 17-year intervals or combine all the 17-year intervals and get these total maps of the broods as I understood them back in the probably 88, 89, I was doing that. Mm-hmm. And that just kept going. It just kept going from there. And then working with Frank in the 80s on mapping out the cicadas in Indiana. And I did the same here in Ohio. And it just kept going. I wrote a book published by the Indian Academy of Sciences called Periodical Cicadas, the Plague and the Puzzle, which is an examination of the history, including some major unpublished manuscripts I was able to come across. And then the Ohio Biological Survey asked if I'd write a little book called In Ohio's Backyard, Periodical Cicadas, in 1999. I laughed because it was a field guide to 3 species. And then that book has now been declared out of print and it's also obsolete because since then we have found a 13-year brood in Ohio that was unrecognized. And now we had 6 species in Ohio. So that meant we had to do a new book. And that led, of course, to the current new book, the Brood 10 edition that just was published by the Ohio Biological Survey last month, in fact. But that was the foundation. And living in Cincinnati, I meant I had cicadas coming out my backyard. And I had this strange feeling that everybody lived in Cincinnati, the 1.8 million people in northern Kentucky, southwest Ohio, and southeastern Indiana that was in earshot of all the media in Cincinnati and that came out. They were part of my lab team. And so I did a lot of crowdsourcing in 87, again in 91, and in 2000, 2004. And we made some significant discoveries thanks to the people living up here. And this sort of led to what I'm doing now, and that is trying to do citizen science and take that data and verify it. Some of the issues about citizen science is that it could be just unverified data. Mm-hmm. You're not even sure. Now I'm able to, as what we've been doing since the advent of the internet and cell phones and what have you, and digital photography and GPS and so on, I can now get lots more information with the help of people that have an interest in cicadas.
Yeah. And I can't wait to dive into some of that and talk about a lot of that in more detail. But let's start with some of the basics first.
Sure.
How many different species of cicadas are there in the eastern U.S.?
I don't know how on the eastern U.S. I've never tried to count them all. I know in Ohio, but for in Ohio, and if you go to cicadamania.com, they've got a list of every state and all the species reported from of cicadas for each state. I'll use Ohio as an example. There are now 20 species and subspecies of cicadas in the state of Ohio, and it's probably close to that in Kentucky. There are 6 species of periodical cicadas in Ohio. There are 7 in Kentucky. Neotrodesum is in Kentucky, but not here in Ohio. And it's on the far western end of the state. We also have, in addition to those 6 species of cicadas in Ohio, we have 12 species, and 2 of them have subspecies. So subspecies and species numbering 12 in the state of what we call annual cicadas. It's very easy to separate these annual cicadas from our periodic cicadas by 3 things. 1, the color. They're going to be green and black, or green, black, and brown. 2, they come out after periodical cicadas come out. They'll start emerging sometime right in early July. I've had a few actually emerge in late June now with some of the warmer temperatures, but that's not surprised. But late. And they'll be out through October, into October. You hear them going there, the bzz, 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 is buzzing in these trees. And the other thing is they don't come out in big numbers. Their whole survival strategy is just the opposite of periodical cicadas. They come out in small numbers and they're up there in the trees and you're looking for, you can hear them singing and you can look for them, but because they're backlit, you don't see them very well. And they're green and they're brown. They're going to blend in with the shrubbery, with the leaves. You don't see them up there, but you hear them. A few years ago, my wife and I were in Athens, Greece. And of course, we heard cicadas, outside a Greek temple. Oh, where are they? Wow. So great. We must have spent 20 minutes before you found the things. And we know that we were really close. It was about 4 feet away. You heard it as loud, but they were so cryptically colored in comparison. So that small population, their coloration and when they emerge is totally different from the periodical cicadas. The periodical cicadas will start emerging in big numbers in early May. They have red eyes. We don't find those in our annual cicadas. They're going to have totally black bodies, except for the underside of the abdomen of some of the species have orange bands on them. And then they got these wings that have orange wing veins. You don't get them mixed up per se. And they come out in early May. And by the end of June, they're done. You won't see the adults anymore. You'll find the carcasses around. Although the last time we had brood 10, I found a few living ones as late as the 5th of July, but they were few and far between. So the periodic cicadas come out earlier, different coloration. You're going to see thousands, millions of them. I went to a cemetery where I did the census under one set of trees. And from there, I could estimate that probably about 250,000 cicadas emerged just in that little section.
Oh, wow. That's crazy.
That's a lot of bugs. So it's very difficult to get them confused. Although I do get questions all the time. Well, don't we had cicadas last year? What's going on there? We have them all the time. Well, yes, we have cicadas, but we're talking about periodical cicadas from brood 10 that's coming out this year. Yeah. And then some areas like Ohio, like Kentucky, you've got several broods in Kentucky. You've got brood 14, you've got brood 10. There are sporadic examples of cicadas coming up during brood 6 years. You've also got brood 19, and you've got brood 23, and we just discovered brood 22 in Kentucky. So you've got a wealth of periodical cicadas in the state.
Yes. And that kind of leads us naturally into another question I had, is that we hear all the time about broods with the cicadas, but how does that relate to species, which is what I think most people are more familiar with, especially with other taxa and other types of organisms?
Sure. There are 7 species of periodical cicadas, and they come out in different years, and we call those year classes essentially broods. And we really didn't get a good handle on what was going on. When I say we were talking about people in the 19th century, until we started to create a numbering system that was consistent. And that started by the work of Charles Marlett, who basically said, okay, by this time we had like 3 or 4 different numbering systems. One was based on years, a couple of them based on broods, but no continuity. And so the decision was the USDA proposed through Charles Marlett's work. Okay, 1893, every 17-year cicada that comes out that year will belong to brood 1. Every 17-year cicada that comes out the next year in 1894, that's brood 2. And numbers 1 through 17, those numbers are reserved for the 17-year cicadas.
Okay.
So by just saying brood 10, we know it's a 17-year cicada. Every 13-year cicada, there are cicadas that have a 13-year life cycle that comes out in 1893. That's going to be brood 18. Everything that comes out in 1894, that's going to be brood 19. And numbers 18 through 30 are reserved for 13-year cicadas. So I talk about brood 23, we know that's a 13-year cicada.
Okay.
Now, once they did that, once we all agreed on this, and it's amazing because we don't agree on anything these days. Then it was possible to go back to the historic records and place those within those brood times. But then as we started looking at that, they started looking at that data and looked at things like, for example, in 1868, brood 19 came out simultaneously with brood 10. That happens once every 221 years when a 13-year brood and a 17-year brood come out at the same time, because 17 times 13 is 221. It happened again in 1885 when brood 23 came out simultaneously with brood 10. So we had these massive maps for brood 10 from 1868 and 1885. The maps weren't that good, but we had reports from all over, like Missouri, for example, which is where you'll find some brood 19 stuff. And the Missouri records were put in with brood 10. But so what happened with that is that it required to find a year that brood 10 came out by itself, and that year was 1902. And so by realizing that and then comparing the 1902 map with the others, they were able to sort of remove all the noise from the other broods and what have you. But by having these brood numbers and then looking in history and then moving forward with those, it was possible to get really nice distribution maps. And that made sense of cicadas coming out in some years. And there are publications from the 18th century that said, we're not sure if it's a 15 or 16-year life cycle. Some say 17. There are a lot of questions like that. But here, let's take what's going on in northern Kentucky over the next few years. We've got brood 10 coming out right now. We're going to have brood 14 come out in 4 years. Is that a 4-year cicada? And then we're going to have brood 22 come out 2 years later after that. Is that a 2-year cicada? And then we're going to have another cicada come out in 2038. That's brood 10 again. Is that an 11-year cicada? And that's what the problem was. You had overlapping broods in certain geographies, which they don't wear numbers on their backs. Brood 23, go 23. And so it wasn't until this numbering system and then carefully looking at maps for particular years for the next 17 and 13 years, and then repeating that we were able to remove that excess noise and get the real broods. So a brood, I call it a year class. It's like a graduating class of 2021.
Okay.
You always have that, but you'll have a 20th anniversary in 20 years in 2041 for the class for 2021. It's a year class like thing that can be commemorated. In this case, it's the 17th anniversary with all the kids coming out.
Okay, that makes sense. And there can be multiple species within each brood or year class.
Yes, with the periodical cicadas that are coming out, the 17-year cicadas coming out this year, there are 3 distinct species. One is Magic Cicada Septundecula. That's the large one. And if you collect all these cicadas, you line them up on a table, you'll find one large one and then a bunch of small ones. There are 2 small species and 1 large species. And you can easily tell them apart if you can look at the underside of the cicada. So for example, turn them over. Magic Cicada Septundecula, which is the large of the 3 that's coming out this year, has on the underside, the abdominal segments are half black with a band of orange. Then the next segment, black with orange and so on.
Okay.
You also look at the eyes. In fact, between the base of the eye and the base of the wing, if there's an orange patch there, that's Septundecula. If there isn't, it's one of the other 2 species. The other 2 species, Magic Cicada cassini, you can flip that over and it's entirely black on the bottom.
Okay.
And so that's how you separate that from Septundecula.
Mm-hmm.
It's also smaller. And then the third species, which is the same size as cassini, is Septundecula. And it has very, very fine, thin orange bands on the abdomen, but no red spot between the eyes and the base of the wings.
Okay.
And so that's Septundecula. So it's easy to tell the 3 apart by looking at them. They also have 3 different calls.
Oh, that's nice. Then you don't have to catch them all.
That's right. And so the call for Septundecula is a sort of high pitch. In the coursing centers, it sounds like a 1950s science fiction movie of the aliens landing. Some B movie back from the 50s. The case of cassini, it starts with a series of clicks and then that's sort of loud sort of sound with all of them together. So it's constant. And the Septundecula sounds very rhythmic. And I've heard them all in the same place. I've collected all 3 species at the same place, but usually depending on the location, one of the 2 species are going to be more predominant. The Septundecula with a that's going to have the smaller distribution. That's the rarest of the 3, 10% at most in some cases. But you'll find that mature woods, upland areas will have probably more Septundecula, and areas along rivers and more lowland areas will have more cassini, especially if it's been disturbed. At the university where I teach, we've got a cemetery that goes back to the 1890s for the Sisters of Charity. And the circular oak trees around the center of the cemetery is loaded with Septundecula. You walk 50 yards where they plant a bunch of Bradford pear, it's all cassini.
Oh, wow.
And then there's some wild areas that they've not clear cut yet. And you'll find some along the edges there, you're going to find some decula, but not many. And so they do in nature without urbanization, they'll separate out. But in urban areas, you'll find all 3 species.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm going to have to start paying attention to the different sounds of them and try and figure out which ones I've got in different places.
Oh, yeah. Last year, Jesse, my wife, and I decided we needed a cicada fix. And a lot of universities weren't allowed to do official travel, but I was able to do that since I'm a dean. So I have some opportunities here. But we also did things like during the time of COVID, we verified that Hilton hotels and Hampton Inns had special cleaning protocols for COVID. Mm-hmm. We wanted to test our app. the Cicada Safari app. So we literally took records for that had been submitted to Cicada Safari, and we went there. It was only a 5.5 hour drive from our house, and off we went looking for this, just to try to see what's going on. Are they really there? Somebody reported, yes, they were there. We've never had an instance where somebody reported cicadas and they didn't have cicadas there. So that was very grateful. But we planned the trip, 48 hours there and back, and spending just one night, bring your own food and what have you. And we got down into West Virginia and it was getting North Carolina. It was getting kind of cloudy and kind of weird. And I hadn't looked at the weather reports for a while. And next thing I realized, we're in the cone of Tropical Storm Bertha, which is coming ashore the next day.
Oh, no.
Fortunately, with weather radar, we were able to plan our driving between rain bands. So we got all the data we needed. We got DNA samples, and we documented what was going on and where the different cicadas were emerging. And then we did find a few mature sites where they were singing, but not as loud as we wanted. But it was a successful trip. But on our way back, we realized we had to go back again to get that cicada fix. To go into a woods where they're just screaming so loud that when you get back in your car after 20 minutes and you close the door, you still hear the cicadas, and you hear the cicadas as you drive down the road because your ears are just going with it. That's what you want.
Oh, yeah. I've done bird banding, and you're like sitting at the station and you're waiting between checks to go look at the nets to see who you've caught. And you're supposed to be listening to the birds and recording what birds you're hearing. And some years when we have the big brood emergences, you can't hear the birds because the cicadas are so loud.
Isn't that great?
Oh, yes. Let's talk a little bit about the life history of the cicadas.
Mm-hmm.
And it'd probably be helpful to mention that cicadas are in the group of insects called true bugs. Mm-hmm. And they really do have a fascinating life history. So I want to share some of that with our listeners. But can you walk through their life history a little bit? And let's start with the nymphs, because I think that will naturally lead into some of the other areas that we've touched on, but haven't really dove into that I know we both really want to talk about.
Oh, certainly. As you mentioned, they're part of the true bugs. That's the order Hemiptera. There's also family Cicadidae, the family of cicadas, of which we've got several species here in the Midwest, if you will. And we're going to start with that last nymphal stage. We'll start with like what's happening now. The first thing to look out for right now, and if you live in northern Kentucky and along the counties along the Ohio River, you should be watching for this. And there's some counties in eastern Kentucky that I expect this is occurring, but they have been mapped in recent years. And we'll get into that more detail, I know. Starting in mid to late April, after a really heavy April shower, I'm talking not quite as bad as that once of a generation storm like we have every year. There's always one. But this, 1 to 2 inches come down. It's mass numbers. You want to go out and look under decks, especially if there's not a slab of concrete there, but look for under a deck, under a overhang that's got a lot of nice clay mud, or in a wooded area that's got a very dense canopy. And you want to look for chimneys. These are little muddy extensions that the cicadas make after a heavy, heavy rain. They look a lot like little chimneys made by crayfish.
Okay.
And so we've got these cicadas. They're in a hole. They're in a tube, a little tunnel, if you will, underground. That tunnel is between 4 and 8 inches down. And here in northern Kentucky and in southwest India and Ohio, we've got a little bit of clay in our soil. And so that cicada movement up and down sort of smooths that side. And so when it rains really heavy, that can actually break the hole at the top, and the water goes down that tube. And as that happens, it starts filling up because it's raining faster than it can literally drain away, if you will. So the cicada crawls up above the water, and when it reaches the opening, it balls up mud and creates a little mud tunnel extension called the chimney or a turret, depending on what book you're looking at. And that can be as tall as up to 10 to 12 inches.
Oh, wow.
I've seen been 3 to 6. And then they're sitting up there above the ground, above where they're the surface of the ground, but in this little tube. Eventually, as the rain stops and the water seeps through and drains out of that hole, they go back down, but the little chimney stays. And I've found these things, if you got like a wood pallet outside, one of these rains, I've seen these under pallets, any kind of protected area, you can find these things. And that's probably some of the earliest cicada sign you'll see. Some homeowners might be seeing increased mole activity in their yard because the cicadas right now are right at the same depth that the moles are running around and are probably enjoying some cicada hors d'oeuvres in the process. So that's the first thing we'll notice. Then historically, this has always been in early May, although in 2017 in northern Kentucky, we had some cicadas emerge as early as April 27th. This was not the massive emergence. 1 or 2 cicadas popping out of the ground here and there. And that happens when the ground temperature reaches 64 degrees Fahrenheit. And what really triggers the mass emergence is a nice drenching rain to soften up the soil. And so if you have ground temperatures of 64 degrees Fahrenheit and in that soaking rain, then they start coming out in massive numbers. The largest numbers I've ever seen coming out would be 356 per square meter.
Wow.
That's a lot of bugs.
That's a lot. Yeah, that's impressive.
And now they don't come out in your open yards. They'll come out under trees because the nymphs, when they hatch, will drop straight down, and they don't move very far underground during their time there. So that will continue over the course of a 2-week period, and even longer. But the major emergence will take about almost 10 days to 2 weeks to sort of unfold. And that's because the cicadas are going to come out earlier on a south-facing tree where the morning sun is going to warm that soil up compared to the north-facing side of that same tree. And so I've actually watched this. You'll see them all come out on the south side, and then eventually more come out on the other side. So it takes a few days for that soil it's not evenly the same temperature. So that's what's involved with that process. So they emerge from the ground from these holes. Holes are about the size and diameter of your pinky. You've got small pinkies in the size of the main finger. And they emerge from these holes, and the nymphs start crawling up a vertical surface. I've seen them on the bark of trees. I've seen them on fence posts, on brick, tombstones. If it's really a dense emergence, they'll just climb up blades of grass, and they'll start that process then of transforming to an adult. They'll lock their tarsal claws, these little claws, the end of their legs, lock it into the bark, get a nice purchase there, and then slowly, and this is what's really cool to do if you're lucky to have cicadas in your backyard like we have here, like I have here in my yard, you'll see a split occurring on the thorax behind the head on the top of the insect, and you'll see this as it opens, it looks all white inside, and as it continues to open, the adult cicada, which is inside the nymph, is going to slowly pull itself out of that nymph. And as that occurs, it's going to be sticking up out of that skin, and then eventually it's going to be hanging totally upside down, being held in place just by the tension of that opening of its nymphal skin. It's that way for 20 minutes or so. And what's going on is this slowly hardening some of its exoskeleton. That way, when it contracts its muscles to try to get out of there, it doesn't just sort of pull everything inward. Mm-hmm. But it eventually will do what I like to call a cicada. Sit up, grab the skin with its legs, and then it wriggles its abdomen free. And when that happens, this poor little cicada is got these shriveled little wings, just pulled out of the nymphal skin. It's going to be a creamy white color with bright red eyes. You'll see 3 little red dots. It's simple eyes, the ocelli. And then behind the head, you'll see these 2 large black blotches, if you are patches. And then the wings are all shriveled up. And so the next thing it has to do is pump fluid through the wings to expand the wings. And eventually you'll see what looks like a typical cicada, except the wings are tent light over the back, like a typical adult cicada would be, except the body is white, a creamy white. The eyes are those 2 black patches. And it's the wings are very, very flexible, almost like lace. That process from what we talked about, getting out of the ground and getting to this point, is about an hour and a half.
Okay.
Now we have to harden the exoskeleton, and that process also occurs as it darkens in color. That's going to be another hour and a half, depending on temperature. And eventually, after 3 hours after it popped out of the ground, we'll have a typical adult cicada with its red eyes, its black body, its orange veined wings, and some orange coloration of the legs. And as soon as at that point, it wanders up the tree to get up to the canopy, because it's still not hard enough to start flying. It's going to take probably 3 to 5 more days before it will start flying.
And is there a time of day when they tend to come out more?
Yeah, they tend to come out more after sundown.
Okay. So you got to be out there at night if you want to watch them actually.
And that's what makes it so interesting, because, at night, your peripheral vision is gone, because you're watching these with the flashlights, and it's just you're just really focused on it. It's really cool. Now, in 2008, when Brood 14 emerged, we had 3 days of just not necessarily downpours by any means, but just sort of a drizzly 3-day period with some mist and what have you. And they came out over the course of the whole day while it was going on, because it wasn't the bright light and what have you. So there was some variation to that depending on what the environmental conditions are. Now, after 3-4 days in the tops of the trees, the males start flying and they start singing. Of course, this time there's heavy predation. I've seen blue jays grab cicadas out, in mid-flight. I've seen dogs, cats, raccoons, squirrels, all sorts of things start chomping on these things. And that's part of their survival strategy. They overwhelm their predators to the point where their predators can eat all the cicadas they want, and there's still billions left. It's kind of a neat thing to do. And then the males will get into a tree, and a male will start singing. That'll attract other males, and eventually this tree is going to be filled with these males, aggregation of males to start the mating process. It's called a lek. But we call these singing trees chorusing centers. They'll be singing away. A female will fly in. And if a female lands on a branch and a male is nearby and he sings, if she hears it, she'll flick her wings. She can't make a call. She's silent, but she does respond by flicking her wings. It's an audible flick. And if he hears that, he'll turn and face her. He'll sing again. She'll flick again. Then he'll get closer and he'll go to a modified mating call where there's no space for her to flick. And then mating ensues. Now, sometimes at this point, other males hear the flick. And so when number one starts to sing, male number two will start to sing just before the point where the female should flick her wings. So the first male doesn't hear it. And then he gets disinterested and leaves. So there's this competition, what have you. If you've ever been in a cicada coursing center area, you'll notice the sound gets really loud and then it just sort of drops down a little bit. And then it gets loud again and then drops down. If a male is unsuccessful at attracting a female after 2 or 3 tries, he will fly to a new branch or a new tree. And it's during that time when all these cicadas fly that the sound drops in intensity and loudness. And then it starts back up again. It's fun. If you're under a tree and you hear that happening, just wait for that slight decrease in sound and loudness, and you'll start seeing all these cicadas flying like crazy. The analogy I've always used is like a giant cicada singles bar. Oh, this branch isn't any good. I'm going to go to the branch over there and try sort of thing, to be anthropocentric about it all. If he's been successful at attracting a mate, they will mate. And then after mating is complete, the female, after a couple of days, will select a tree to lay her eggs in. And that involves using an ovipositor, an egg-laying structure, which is a sort of like blade-like structure that she has on her the tip of her abdomen. It's got a central rod and then 2 cutting surfaces that are sort of alternate. And some research I did with a colleague of mine, Matt Leonard at Kent State University, the Stark campus, we analyzed the chemical composition of those serrated edges. And it turns out it's reinforced with metal.
What?
It's got metal in it, zinc and manganese and other metals. And that's not uncommon. We got the idea to look for this because the ichneumoniid wasps that lay their eggs under bark, their egg-laying structure, ovipositor, is also reinforced with metal. And beetles that chew into tree bark, their mandibles are reinforced with metal to help them be able to chew in. So I thought it made perfect sense that cicadas would have the same kind of armory.
Yeah.
And sure enough, they do. So that was that was just published last year.
Yeah, that's interesting. I always wondered how they got through the bark like that, especially like with the wasps. That's fascinating.
They have the central rod, and these 2 serrated knives are pushing into the bark. And of course, the female lays her eggs in the terminal ends of the branches where the new leaves are. What she does is she finds a spot, she pierces the thing and inserts her ovipositor, and as she's pulling out, she deposits pairs of eggs on each side of where her ovipositor is, anywhere between 10 to 20, maybe 30 eggs in that spot. It's about 1/4 inch in length. She pulls it out, walks 1/4 inch, does it again, and keeps going until she runs out of branch or she runs out of eggs. One of my students actually counted all the eggs from 3 different broods, and we found that the average was right around just over 500 eggs per female.
And does she only mate once, or will she mate multiple times?
Apparently, 85% of the females will mate once.
Okay.
10% will mate twice, and 5% will mate 3 times. After the male has exhausted his sperm supply and the female has exhausted her eggs, which is pretty quickly, they die. The carcasses collect at the base of trees where they'll get rained on by some late June rain, early July rain. In the heat of summer, they start to stink. It's a lot of biomass out there that's going to rot.
Oh, yeah.
So meanwhile, up in the trees, the place where the female laid her eggs, those branches can be damaged a little bit by the egg laying, tearing up the xylem area and some of the vascular tissue. And when that happens, the leaves will actually wither and turn brown. And sometimes the branch will even break at that point. And that's called flagging. That flagging doesn't kill the tree because not every branch is going to flag like that, but it does actually decrease the success of the eggs to about 50% mortality of the eggs in a flagged branch. But that occurs sometimes if the number of available trees is limited. You can find cicadas laying their eggs on the top and the bottom of the same branch. That can be all sorts of problems in that case. But if they run out of suitable trees, they can fly up to about probably just slightly less than around a mile at most, probably to look for oviposition sites. The eggs will hatch in 6 to 8 weeks, sort of towards the end of July into early August. And the nymphs crawl out of the hole that the ovipositor went to and promptly, literally just let go and drop straight to the ground. Because they are vulnerable, really vulnerable at this time. Because there's spiders, there's ants, there's ground beetles, there's all sorts of things that would love to eat a whole mess of little cicada nymphs. They find a blade of grass or a weed and they get right below the soil as soon as possible. And I've seen this. It's amazing how fast this happens. It's like they're gone. And they'll feed on grass roots or the roots of small weeds for the next few weeks. And by New Year's Day, I actually went on New Year's Days and dug these things up. They are 10 to 12 inches below the surface, already feeding on a tree root. And that's where they'll be for the next 17 years until the soil turns 64 degrees Fahrenheit and it happens again.
That's fascinating. So you said that's where they'll be for the next 17 years. Is that just for the 17-year broods?
There are 3 13-year cicada broods, and so those nymphs will stay under there for 13 years.
Okay.
But the 17 years will stay on there for 17 years, unless they accelerate, which is another phenomenon that we've been seeing a lot recently. They come out 4 years early or 1 year late, or 1 year early, 4 years early, or 4 years late. That happens as well.
Oh, wow.
You get their clocks mixed up.
So if they get their clocks mixed up, does the next cycle, would like, say they came out 4 years ago, it's supposed to be 17 years, they came out 4 years ago. Would the next cycle, the ones that are in the ground now, would they come out 17 years from when they went in, or do they come out 21 years and kind of catch back up with everybody else?
Well, it's a neat phenomenon. We got data on this now. It's kind of cool. And in fact, what happened 4 years ago actually did happen. We had a 4-year acceleration of brood 10 in 2017. And they came out, and this is a study I've been involved with since 91 when I was monitoring how fast they were growing underground. And the first time this study came out early was in the year 2000 here in Cincinnati in big numbers. And in 5 locations, they came out in such numbers, they overwhelmed predators. They sang, they mated, they laid eggs, they actually reproduced. That had not been documented before.
Okay.
And so normally when cicadas would come off cycle, that happens all the time. I've got off cycle emergences in 66 in Boone County, Kentucky, and other years. But usually when that happens, all the cicadas get eaten because not that many come out.
Mm-hmm.
So in the year 2000, we had 5 locations in greater Cincinnati where they came out in numbers great enough to overwhelm predators to mate and reproduce. And so the question was, but as you asked, will they stay 13 years or will they shift back to 17?
Mm-hmm.
I had to wait 13 years.
Mm-hmm.
2013, I go to some of my study sites and I find shells. They're coming out. That evening, I'm stalking around this neighborhood, these neighborhoods, but that one was really fun. And I'm seeing these cicadas, they're emerging like crazy by the hundreds, not as many as I would expect, but they were quite a few.
Mm-hmm.
Went back the next day, couldn't find a single cicada. They'd all been eaten. Found wings, bits of legs, went back the next night, some more came out. Next day, nothing, nada. Not a single cicada was reported singing. I'd been there several times. I never heard one singing. They all got consumed. And that's what normally happens. That's 13 years. So they didn't stay 13 years. Some stayed 13 years, but they didn't do anything because they all got eaten. Okay, I wait 4 more years. And they came out by the thousands. Probably also joined by more brood 10 cicadas accelerating. But now they came up by enormous numbers. And instead of just having 5 locations all over Southwest Ohio and Northern Kentucky, we had singing and mating and egg laying. 33 locations in particular I was able to document that was taking place. And so now we have an established large group of cicadas that are going to come out on 17-year intervals, not during brood 10 years, but during brood 6 years. They've shifted. Now, I won't be able to document anybody's coming out late because that's going to be this year, and brood 10 is going to come out in those same places.
Right.
But in those places where that happened, there should be fewer cicadas in those locations than we saw back in the year 1987, because a portion of that population has come out early and now is permanently shifted.
Right.
This is exciting. We've actually seen how a brood can shift. And when you look at the distribution of broods, in Virginia, for example, we've got brood 9. It's always adjacent to brood 5. And brood 5 is adjacent to brood 1. 4-year intervals. Southwest Ohio, Northern Kentucky, we got brood 14. What's it adjacent to? It's adjacent to brood 10, 4 years apart. And now we've got a brood 6 population popping up in the middle of this. And so this really implies that there's a pattern, a real pattern going on with these 4-year accelerations as it relates to the distribution of the broods.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Oh my gosh, we could go into so many rabbit holes there.
Oh, that's for sure.
I want to make sure we talk about the brood 10 emergence, because I know that's what a lot of people are thinking about. And it's something that's really interesting and fascinating for me because we've got listeners from all over. I mean, I know we've got some listeners from Utah and out west, but most of our listeners are in the eastern part of North America, but primarily eastern US. So we've got this brood 10 emergence happening in a good portion of that area. I'm in Kentucky, and I've seen multiple maps and heard multiple things about brood 10 emerging in Kentucky and how many thousands or millions of cicadas we're going to have. But then when I look at the maps, it's really interesting because some maps show all of Kentucky, some maps show portions of Kentucky, and depending on what map you look at, different portions of Kentucky. Where I'm at, kind of in south central Kentucky, a lot of times if the maps don't have all of Kentucky, then I'm not included in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so how exactly does this work? And I know you're doing some great research and looking for people to help you with some of your research on just mapping out and figuring out where these different broods are happening. So can you go into that some?
Certainly. Well, that's the key, is to figure out where are the cicadas going to be. And I'll use your state, Kentucky, as the example. We've got records going back to 1800 in the state of Kentucky. And the other thing that's occurring that's very exciting is the fact that over the last 20 years, we have discovered whole broods that have been missed.
Interesting.
You'd think after, there's over 2,800 papers have been written about periodical cicadas.
Mm-hmm.
You'd think we'd have the broods down. But no, there in recent years, there have been 2 instances of whole populations of broods that were missing. Brood 1 in eastern Tennessee was missed entirely. And it's always been there. I went back and looked at some historic data, and I found there's records that it's been there, but no one seemed to be monitoring it and marking it on maps for other years. In my case, I had this occur in a roundabout way. Monty Lloyd was one of the great cicada workers of the middle years. And he and I worked on a number of projects together, and we did some work on the acceleration that occurred in the year 2000 together and so on. And he passed, and I was at the University of Chicago giving a lecture at his memorial symposia series. And I get an email from Falmouth, Kentucky. We've got cicadas. This is 2001. There were no cicadas expected in 2001 in Ohio or in Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't quite believe him. I thought, it's late May. Okay, I'll come. I drive down to his place, and they were periodical cicadas. No question. I thought, this is really weird. And then I remembered in 1987, we had a big emergence of brood 10. And a year later, 1988, we had another rather sizable emergence of brood 10. They were singing and mating. I got photographs of all this, and that's really wild. And Monty Lloyd had published a paper a little earlier, right after, in the late 70s, on cicadas emerging after 18 years. And this was cicadas in Mason, Kentucky, that had emerged a year out in 1975 after brood 14 had emerged in 1974. And so I thought in 88, Monty's really gone to something. This is actually happening here. Didn't think anything of it until I get this email from Falmouth. And I start counting. 88 to 2001, 13. 88 to 1975, 13. Now, in my work here in Southwest Ohio, I've got areas that I call them study sites, so I can go back and check to see what's going on. Mm-hmm. And so where the cicadas had emerged in 1988, I had several of these locations. And I went back to them, and there were cicadas every single one of them.
Okay.
We had a 13-year cicada in northern Kentucky and Southwest Ohio. Mm-hmm. Now, for me, I want to have not 1 or 2, I want to have 4 consecutive emergences of it to verify that there's a true brood there. So I'm looking, how can I prove that there were cicadas there in 1962? And so I was, looking through the papers, didn't see much. And then I was talking with one of the naturalists at the, along with the locks and dams. They said, oh yeah, back when they built Melhill Lock and Dam in 62, they had to shut the construction down for a couple of days to get the locusts off the rigs. They were there in 62.
Yeah.
They were there in 75. They were there in 88. They were there in 2001. We had a periodical cicada in a 13-year interval in Southwest Ohio and Northern Kentucky.
Yeah.
So I published this in a book, Periodical Cicadas, The Plague and the Puzzle, and I reviewed the brews. And a number of my colleagues, and this is what makes good science, didn't believe me.
Mm-hmm.
Even though my good friend Roy Troutman was out mapping with me. We had photographs like galore. I even turned specimens into people for DNA work. So we had to wait till 2014 to prove to people there were 13-year cicadas here. Mm-hmm. You've got to be very patient to work on cicadas.
Yeah, I'm catching on to that.
And so 2014, You gonna come see cicadas? Well, let us know when they emerge. Sticker, sticker, sticker.
Mm.
They're here in big numbers. So researchers now start coming into northern Kentucky and southwest Ohio. Just 2 counties left. I had them in 3 counties in 2001. They're only in 2 counties now in southern Ohio because it gets fragmented. But the population, though, in northern Kentucky is really good in some places. They'll be around for a bit. But it was great. And we were able to verify not only that it was a 13-year brood, but because it turns out one of the 13-year species has a slightly different pitch call, and you can tell from the call if they're 13-year cicadas or not. It had the 13-year cicada call. And then we were able to get specimens that had the coloration pattern of Magicicada tridecim, which is different from all the other species. It's only found in a 13-year cicada. And by golly, we found it. So we actually found a new brood. Now, why was it missing? When the USDA did their mapping in 1923, they did a map of brood 14. That was also the year that brood 22 emerged. They did a follow-up map in 1936 for brood 10. Brood 22 emerged that year simultaneously with 10. So if you look at the maps from 36 to 23, all these locations are in those maps. Mm-hmm. But no one caught on that they were 13-year forms because of that overlap. In 1949, there was no concerted effort to map periodical cicadas at all, so we didn't have that year. Nor was there a concerted. There was concerted effort in some states in 1962, but no concerted effort was done because no one expected in there.
Right.
But there we are, a whole brood of 13-year cicadas that people had missed continuously. Why they were missed before in the late 19th century is unknown. Just nobody thought anything. Oh, the locusts are here again. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way it is with a lot of things, is we just get used to it, and so we don't even think about it as being anything special or different.
Yeah. And that's what we hope to find out this year with our app, Cicada Safari. And that is to have people go out. And if you look at the distribution maps, and if you go to cicadasafari.org, there's a map there for brood 10. If you download the Cicada Safari app, that map is on the app as well. And you'd see you're not living at a place where we have indicated that brood 10 should be. That doesn't mean you're out of luck. You take the app and you go out and look for cicadas in your area to see that they could be there, especially if you're close. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of negative records. We can't necessarily, ascertain per se, but if you're out looking for them, you're going to find them because, after all, let's face it, it's hard to miss a periodical cicada. You can hear them. Some years you can map these things by driving 60 miles an hour down the road and opening the window and hear if you hear the calls, and you know that you can get a pretty good map that way if you need to. But that's what we're really hoping happens, is we can fill in these gaps. I'm hopeful that we're going to find areas where brood 10 has been thought to have been lost or was never reported in the first place, but is coming out this year. Yeah.
So if people want to help out, whether they're is it just Kentucky that you're interested in, or other places as well?
We are mapping the entire brood from Pennsylvania, New York, all the way across to the east side of Illinois and south all the way down into northern Georgia. We're trying to get people from all over the country to help us. I'm happy to say that just last week we had our 30,000th download.
Oh, nice.
And we're adding about 650 a day as we're going.
That's impressive.
As I mentioned earlier, the USDA did a concerted effort in 1902 mailing out these postcards. They got 900 records. When we tested the app last year for brood 9, we had just shy of 8,000 photographs submitted.
Nice.
We could get conceivably 50,000 photographs. I want to be overwhelmed with this. I want to be able to really sort of fill in these spaces if we can. And so all people have to do is to go to the App Store for Apple or Google Play and download the app. It's free. We do not share the users with anybody. After you log in, you'll see a series of pictures, and if you touch that picture, behind it is a whole story about what the picture is about. Like, why do cicadas come out in big numbers? You can learn about that. What do the species come out? How do I tell the sexes apart? You touch that, all that information is there. And then what we want you to do is go out on your own cicada safari and look for periodical cicadas. And if you see one, the app will say, I want permission to use your camera. And it'll also ask permission to use your location services. You say only for this app when in use. That way there's no tracking. We don't track anything, but all we want to know is where the cicadas are. Take the picture of the cicada, and then after you've taken the picture, there's a little paper airplane icon. You touch that and it sends us the picture. And I have been training students and my colleagues to help us identify the photographs. And that's what makes Cicada Safari such an important tool, is every photograph becomes the voucher specimen to show that you're really looking at a periodical cicada. Once it's approved, it goes onto our live map that you can then monitor and actually see, there's my cicada. And if you zero in on that map, you can touch it and you'll actually see your picture.
Mm-hmm.
And it's part of the record. And we've got our own server space that we're storing these things up as an archive for the future. And because you can only have so many icons at a map, if you zoom back, you might see, oh, Central Kentucky's got 55 cicadas there. And as you zoom in, they'll scatter to the locations where they actually are. Right. We've got a leaderboard to see who submits the most images. That's all very important information. We're really interested in things like, what day do they start coming out in big numbers?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of important data. One of the new things you can do with Cicada Safari is you can submit 10-second video. And so when they start calling, you just take a recording, hold it to the tree and record this, and we can hear the calls. And from there, we can tell what species are singing. And that verifies that potential mating is going to take place, because that's the coursing center. Mating's happening. That's what it's all about. And so, as I said, last year, we had just shy of 8,000 photographs. We tested it also on Brood 8 2 years ago. And we had 5,721 verified periodical cicada observations submitted.
Nice.
And so we are hoping, we need to be overwhelmed. We want to be overwhelmed with this.
Mm-hmm.
And so to make cicadas more fun, if you touch on the more info link, it takes you to cicadasafari.org, where we've got activities for kids. That's all free. We want people to really enjoy this emergence. I've got the instructions there on how to fold an origami cicada. I had a school system in Ohio that's, I think those kids folded more origami cicadas than emerged in their town, but that's okay. We've got how to do historical research. One of the things I find that's a lot of fun to do is, after the cicadas have emerged, pour plaster Paris down the hole. Ooh. And let it dry over a couple of days, and then excavate it like an archaeological dig.
Mm-hmm.
And look at the tunnels. You can actually see a little model of the tunnel.
Oh, that'd be cool.
And so there's a lot of neat stuff you can do. If you got a science fair you're going to be part of, here's a science fair project for you. The first day they start coming out, collect the shells. You can sex the shells. And you'll see that the first few days, they're almost predominantly male. And then eventually they become equal in number, and then more females come out. And so you're able to look at the changing demographics of how the cicadas are emerging. The first cicadas that come out are males. They're going to be eaten, many of them. And that's not a problem, because some females will be able to find other males to mate with in the population. So you let that vanguard, these first males, sort of give their lives so that other cicadas may survive. And that's important. That's fun data that you can use. If you monitor and keep your own little cicada diary, what day did they come out? How many did you see? Go outside and count the number of holes in a certain square, take a yardstick or two, flags or boundaries each end, count all the holes. That's hard to do. So what I tend to do is I put spoons down all the holes. And then once all the holes are filled, I then collect and count all the spoons, because it's easy to get them mixed up when they're in large numbers. So there's a lot of neat things that you can do. And that data is interesting data. So there's a lot of projects that kids can do. And then in September, after the eggs have hatched, you can actually pick up the twigs that have broken off the trees with the egg nests on it. If you're comfortable using things like small knives or things, you can actually dissect out the eggs. And the ones that have hatched are all transparent. The ones that haven't are solid. And you can figure out, well, it's the percentage of cicadas that are hatching in my trees. And you can look at how many cicada eggs hatched from a maple versus an oak versus an ash.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of neat science fair projects for kids to do, and interesting information, some of which is publishable quality. So
yeah, that is very interesting. Okay, I've got two questions I have to ask. First of all, you were saying you can sex the exoskeletons. How?
Yeah. Well, you've got to turn them over and look at the naughty bits. You can see on females the development of the ovipositor. It looks like a small slit or a line right at the tip of her abdomen. The male doesn't have that.
Okay.
So, and that's on the empty shell. You can easily see that in the empty shell.
Okay. I didn't know about that trick, so I'll have to start looking at that as I start finding them.
You can also take the shells to species, but if you take all your shells, you line them up, you're going to see there'll be one large and the others are small. The large one's easy to tell by just the sheer size. The smaller ones require the use of a micrometer and measurements to take those to species, but that's probably a little more than what people need to do, and they might not have access to a micrometer and a microscope, but that's also possible.
Okay. I've noticed that some are bigger and some are smaller, but general observation is as far as I've ever taken it.
And now with cell phones, everybody's got this research equipment. There are free apps you can get for your, I'm sure for the Droid, I use an iPhone, but there are free apps to let you measure how loud they are.
Oh,
decibel meters are free now that you can get on your iPhone. You can, of course, you're taking good photographs with GPS location about where they were taken, so you can help map these things out. There's all sorts of neat stuff you can do with your cell phone.
Yes, and hopefully lots of people will be getting on and helping with the Cicada Safari project, because this just sounds absolutely fascinating and so easy and so much fun to help with. But do you have to do it on your cell phone? Can you do it on the computer?
It's a little more difficult. If you have, yes, you can. It's a little more difficult. You need a DSLR that has a
Mhm.
GPS built in.
Okay.
We need to have that metadata attached to the photograph because of just not that people are going to be making errors or sending bad information. It reduces the likelihood of transcription error and
Mhm.
things like that. And you can submit photographs by email to Cicada Safari if necessary. But we really recommend the app because that's where people are going to be just large scale. It'll take a few more days to check the email stuff because it requires opening up a couple other things to get to the metadata, whereas it's automatic with Cicada Safari.
Most people are now using smartphones for stuff like this, but some people still like the computer. So I always like to
Mm-hmm.
check and make sure what the options are.
Certainly. If they do that and they have pictures, there is a Magic Cicada project on iNaturalist that's run by my wife, and it's linking with our Cicada Safari as well. So if they want to do that with the computers, they can certainly do that on iNaturalist.
Okay. So if they're more computer based, you would recommend going more the iNaturalist route. Cell phones go with Cicada Safari.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Because the key thing I want is the data.
Mhm.
It's not like a jurisdiction thing for me. I'm anxious to get the best map possible. And I know for last year with Brood 9, we received 8 Cicada Safari entries for every entry that went to iNaturalist for that brood.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that I can help you guys get the best data that you can get too. And if kind of generally sorting it out that way works best, then let's just go ahead and say generally sorting out.
Yeah. And there's a lot that needs to be done, especially in Kentucky. What's going on in Eastern Kentucky is there's lots of historic records scattered throughout Eastern Kentucky, but there's never been a real thorough survey of the entire portion of that state. We got good information along the counties west of Cincinnati and west of Cincinnati along the Ohio River. But yet there are more counties in Western Kentucky that have reported Brood 10 cicadas. And I'm pretty confident there are counties in Kentucky that have never been brought into the Brood 10 fold.
So this is going to be interesting. I'm going to have to not only get out there and do it myself, but also pay attention to the data and see what it says,
Yeah.
what it actually turns out to be.
Mm-hmm. Might have to have a follow-up session to talk about what we've learned about Kentucky and Brood 10.
Oh, I'd love to do that. That would be fascinating.
Yeah, even though they come out once every 17 years, they occupy my time in between.
One thing I want to make sure before we wrap this up that we talk about is if any of our listeners are concerned about cicadas, emergence, and any damage they might cause to their trees and stuff. I know the answers to this question, but let's go ahead and let them hear from you as the cicada expert. What, if anything, do they need to do about having potentially thousands and thousands of cicadas coming out and cutting these slits in their trees and laying eggs and all of that?
Well, first of all, cicadas don't spread disease. They don't bite humans. They're not going to carry away your children. So you don't have to leave the kids inside all May and June. The cicadas do a lot of good in the environment. The holes they make in the ground is like a natural aeration. It allows rainwater to get to the roots of the trees, especially when we start getting the dry months of summer. The adults that are eaten by predators are like this wonderful food source that allows for a population pulse, which helps some species recover that were maybe been struggling in the past. The egg laying in trees, which is what causes the damage. We'll talk about that in a second. But that egg laying in the trees, especially when they break, it's like a natural pruning. And the leaf set and the flower set next year will be even bigger than they are in normal years. So that allows the trees to actually have a pulse of more fruit being produced once every 17 years. That can be beneficial. And then lastly, the decaying carcasses in the ground around the bases of trees, all those nutrients actually go into the soil down those emergence holes and form a nutrient cache for the trees. And so that's what they do. No, if all the cicadas were destroyed under trees, our trees would still be there. But there is a benefit to having these once every 17 years, these pulses that provide more food for birds, for example, or pulses of more fruit being produced by trees. That can be beneficial in the long-term survival of those organisms. The biggest danger in the past that we've had to cicadas is they're considered a tree pest. There are pesticides that are labeled for periodical cicadas. They're not recommended because you've got to spray them on the trees. There's not a lot of residual thing that's going to be picked up. So save your money. Don't worry about it. If your tree is bigger than 4 or 5 feet in height, the tree's going to be fine. They're not going to cause a problem. If you are planning on planting some saplings and you can wait towards the end of June, that's the easiest.
Okay.
That way the cicadas won't lay eggs in them. If you planted them last year and they're still not very big, there are things you can do. For example, you can create a barricade between the leaves and the branches. For example, last year during Earth Day, the university gave out oaks, saplings. So I've got one planted outside the house here. And there's a screen around it because the deer were having a field day on those new leaves. So I stopped the deer from feeding. But now that screen that I put around them is also going to stop cicadas from laying any eggs in that little tree. But otherwise, if it's a little bit bigger, let's say it's 3 to 4 feet, it's got 3 or 4 branches, you can wrap them in some kind of a gauze or a material that allows air to pass through it. You don't use plastic, for example. Don't wrap them like a giant Q-tip or a mummy. Just create a little barrier for so the cicada females can't get there to lay their eggs. And you've got time. You can wait to see, do you have any cicadas coming up in your yard first? And then if you have a lot, you can then wrap it up because they won't be laying eggs for a few days after they start singing. So you've got some time there to possibly prepare and know what to do. But in most instances, the trees aren't harmed. They actually benefit by the natural pruning.
And I would kind of assume too that those little saplings aren't going to be the first choice for the females. I mean, I would assume they'd be up in the bigger trees where they don't have to go as far and they've got more area.
It's one of the things that's been discussed a lot. When a female cicada is looking for a tree to lay her eggs, what is she looking for? Monty Lloyd made this comment back in the 80s. She's looking for a tree that is certainly mature up to survive 17 years, usually surrounded by low vegetation and in full sunlight. And so the optimal tree would be something like your backyard. If there's cicadas in the area, they might see that and be very much attracted to that tree because that's going to be a tree that will last for 17 years. So you'll find them along the edges in greater numbers. You're going to find them in the dense, deep woods. You're going to find those areas where they always had cicadas, but not like the numbers we're getting in some of the urban areas. In fact, Monty Lloyd had a paper, why are cicadas more common in cities and towns? And that's because we created this ideal cicada habitat in cemeteries and city parks and people's backyards. And that could be the ultimate refuge for cicadas as their numbers. If land use and deforestation starts to take an impact in the States, it may be cities where they hang on for their next generation. But there is concern about cicada numbers declining, but Brood 10 is not death's door yet. Although it has declined in northern Indiana and northwest Ohio, it's still there in small numbers.
Very interesting. And I could keep asking questions and keep talking to you for hours and keep going on down different rabbit holes. I've got about 10 in my head already that I want to go down. But we've been talking for quite a while, so probably should think about wrapping this up pretty soon. But do you have anything else you want to share with us before we do so?
The one thing I'd like to ask your listeners to do is to join Cicada Safari, help us map out this brood. Especially, we need to get better data in Kentucky and in Tennessee, and even in the western portion of North Carolina. That's a very important area that we need to have some more coverage from. And enjoy this. I have had in my career, I've now consulted with my 82nd couple to try to figure out when they want to have their weddings because they don't want cicadas there, or they would like to have cicadas there. I've had several people ask, when are the cicadas emerging? We want to come see them. I've had a couple people say, when are the cicadas emerging? I want to get out of town. But basically, look forward to this. It's a once in a generation event. Take your kids. They'll never forget it. They'll take their kids and they'll talk about what happened when you took them there. And they'll take their grandkids and that'll continue. It's a moment in a family's life that lives on after people are gone.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they can be amazing. I always look forward to when the emergences are coming because I just like cicadas. They're fun. But then I've grown up in Kentucky, so they've always been a part of my summers in one form or another, whether it's the periodicals or just the annuals. But yes, I'll definitely put a link to Cicada Safari in the show notes so people can just go to the show notes and go straight to it. You also sent me several other links that I will put in just for people that are interested. And I will definitely have a link to your book as well, because there's lots of fun things to learn about.
Thank you. It's published by the Ohio Biological Survey, so it goes to help their work. And what they do is they survey, they look for distributions. And one of the things we're publishing a new book on the reptiles of Ohio is coming out in the next month. 1,100 pages on conservation and the distribution of all the species of reptiles in the state.
Nice. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. And again, thank you so much for all of your time. And yeah, I'm looking forward to what's going to happen in the next few weeks and seeing what happens with the cicadas in my area and do we get them? But yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Enjoyed it.
Yes, I did too. Have a great day.
Sure. You too. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye. I really appreciate Gene taking the time to talk with us Periodical cicadas are so interesting, and their emergences play such an important role in the local ecosystem. I enjoyed learning more about the periodical cicadas themselves, but I also enjoyed learning about the interplay between the historic records and the scientific data, and just how important that can be when studying periodical cicadas. I highly recommend everyone to document and report any periodical cicada emergences that they see. Since we recorded this in 2021, it was the brood X emergence that we really focused on in our conversation and that we were talking about looking forward to. But other broods will emerge in other years, so no matter when you listen to this, it's likely that there will be an emergence somewhere in the country, and those emergences will need to be mapped and documented as well. This is also true if you are listening to this in 2021, but live in an area where you don't have brood 10. That's okay. Just wait. You'll have another brood coming up soon, probably, and can help document that one. These brood emergences are one of those situations where all of us working together over a relatively short period of time really can make valuable contributions to our scientific understanding of the natural world. And the more people who submit data to Gene through Cicada Safari or iNaturalist, the more detailed and comprehensive those brood emergence maps can be. Let's grant Gene's wish and completely overwhelm him with data. Who knows? Maybe you'll even help identify one of those undocumented broods that have been overlooked for centuries, or one of those accelerated emergences like Gene talked about. That would be really exciting. And if it does happen to you, please let me know, just because I'm curious and I want to celebrate and share the excitement with you. Before I wrap this up, I wanted to let you know about my email list. Every week, I send short emails with links to the most recent Backyard Ecology blog article and podcast episode, as well as any other news of interest. It's the best way to make sure that you never miss anything in the Backyard Ecology world. If you haven't signed up, then I encourage you to do so at www.backyardecology.net/subscribe. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yard and community.